and thanks everyone who's joined this session this afternoon. This is the second masterclass which we're holding leading up to the New South Wales privacy event on the 8th of May, which is during Privacy Awareness Week, in the afternoon of the 8th of May. Originally, of course, we planned a slightly more elaborate and much more face-to-face event. Nonetheless, we've been running the masterclasses as online activities. This is the second. Those who attended yesterday will know just how brilliant that was. Today's will be just as brilliant as we have Teresa Anderson and Verity Firth presenting for us. But we should, before we begin, Teresa, if we can just move to the next slide, begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. We are all meeting digitally, but each and every one of us is sitting on the land of traditional owners, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to those traditional owners and custodians on whose lands we walk, work and live. We would also like to pay respects to the elders, both past, present and emerging, descendant of the traditional custodians of this place we now call Sydney, and extend that respect to any Indigenous people listening to this webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to say thank you for joining, thank you to our presenters, and pass to our presenters.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? It's Verity Firth. I'm assuming it's all going well, so I will just commence. So thank you very much for joining us today. I don't think that there can be a more pertinent time to be discussing building public trust in data collection, storage and use. I want to say at the outset that despite my name appearing as a presenter of this masterclass, this really is Teresa Anderson's masterclass. And today I will much more be playing the role of discussant rather than leader. Like many of us, I imagine, I have been absolutely overwhelmed, probably busier than I've ever been in my whole life. And as much as I wanted to be an equal participant in this masterclass, Teresa really has done the absolute bulk of the work. So I want to thank her and talk about how I'll be a discussant. However, before I hand over to Teresa, I did want to say a few words about the crisis we find ourselves in and the urgent related need to build public trust in data collection, storage and use. So I'm Verity Firth. I'm currently the Executive Director of Social Justice at the University of Technology, Sydney. Prior to this job, I was the CEO at the Public Education Foundation. And prior to that job, I was in politics as Minister for Education and Training in the New South Wales Government. In the design of this masterclass, Teresa and I decided that we wanted to explore 4 key questions of relevance to the Policy Summit. We wanted to explore the question of how might we create transparency through community engagement and review? How do we raise awareness and create acceptance by explaining and demonstrating outcomes? How do we ensure that decision makers are aware of the need to build public trust and accepting of the need for citizen engagement? And how do we co-design solutions with users and the community? The third question was the one that I was most interested in as someone who used to work in politics. How do we ensure that decision makers are aware of the need to build a public trust and are then in turn accepting of citizen engagement? I think the recent debate over the COVID Safe app has clearly demonstrated the political need to build trust. I think politicians are all over the political need to build trust. But there is a difference between recognising the political need to gain the trust of the people in order to achieve your desired goal and actually believing that a more inclusive and engaged approach to the collection and use of data will improve the validity of the data itself. Participatory models of engagement with citizens work because they not only confer legitimacy to the body that's seeking to gather the data, but those methods of engagement also lead to better, more precise and more usable data. Now, because we are in the midst of a pandemic, I have been reading up about pandemics, and I recently finished a book called The Ghost Map by Stephen Johnson. The book traces the slow and fastidious data collection of a doctor called John Snow during the major cholera outbreak in London in the 1850s. As one of the first epidemiologists, Dr. Snow painstakingly interviewed survivors of the cholera epidemic to try and prove his theory that cholera was spread through the consumption of contaminated water and not via the noxious air and stink that permeated London at the time. The Board of Health and other authorities were sceptical of his theory. A local curate, Reverend Henry Whitehead, was equally sceptical of Dr. Snow's theory, as the Board Street water pump, the purity of which was questioned by Dr. Snow, was considered one of the safest water pumps in Soho and was much trusted by local residents. So Reverend Whitehead decided that he wanted to prove Dr. Snow wrong. He went from door to door interviewing his flock, interviewing the people that he worked with every day, collecting data. As he talked to the locals he knew so well, his mind began to change. As the book describes, and I quote, Whitehead's local knowledge gave him a crucial edge in this investigation, in that he was uniquely able to track down the hundreds of residents who had fled the neighbourhood in the weeks after the outbreak. He could also draw upon the extensive social network he'd long ago established in the neighbourhood to elicit more detailed memories and more crucial clues from surviving residents. In other words, the data that Reverend Whitehead was able to glean from the residents was far superior and, in fact, more accurate than the data the esteemed epidemiologist had been able to collect. Locals opened up to Whitehead in a way that they hadn't opened up to Dr. Snow. In the end, it was all about trust. 170 years later, and this time the government is asking for data from its citizens in the form of the COVID Safe app. And whether or not people trust the government will be crucial in the app's effectiveness as a tracking tool. Without trust, the app won't work. And as Teresa will outline later in the masterclass, trust building in the 21st century remains as personal, local, and ultimately political as it was in the 19th century. Over to you, Teresa.
Verity, thank you so much for that very apt opening. It's not like we organized a pandemic to help us to discuss this topic, but as you said, if ever there was a time to engage in the question of building public trust, this is it. For any people who have joined us since we started, welcome. And just a short bit of housekeeping first, that for the purpose of easing communication during today's session, just make sure that everyone who has joined us place themselves on mute. And if you have any questions, use the chat. You'll find the chat button that's located on the menu bar in the center of your Teams window. Mark, who you may have met at the door when you were coming in, will be acting as a moderator. He's going to raise themes with us as they come up, and you will also be seeing that we have 2 shared Google Docs that we're going to try to use to co-create some frameworks for moving forward. So throughout this, I'm going to be guiding you through not just the question of trust and why trust matters, trying to unpack the trust deficit, dealing with some propositions for building trust, and co-designing, hopefully moving us towards themes that we can take into the Privacy Summit. We're also, just so everyone is aware, we are recording this session for workshopping purposes, so please be aware of that. I guess I should also introduce myself a little bit. It's very odd staring at my computer screen instead of the audience. My name is Teresa Anderson, and I'm a social informaticist and data ethicist. Until recently, I was an associate professor at the University of Technology, Sydney, where I was the founding course director of the Master of Data Science and Innovation. I'm now working as an independent scholar, working predominantly for myself, also for some not-for-profits, including the International Science Council's Committee on Data, where I've been doing some work on resilience in smart cities. Now, as a social informaticist, I'm going to be examining today's themes of privacy, trust, and data through 4 predominant lenses. This is the modus operandi of social informatics: the socio-historical, an information science lens, a socio-technical one, and also a political one. So largely in this masterclass, there'll be 3 recurring themes that you will hear unfolding. Verity has started us off with that lovely discussion about how to make sense of a crisis, which in that case was a cholera epidemic in London. And there'll be a few other socio-historical snapshots of trust in crisis that I want to share with you, because I think one thing that a lot of my students will tell you is that I believe very strongly in trying to learn lessons for the future from our past. And I don't think we've done that well enough to this point. I also am going to be presenting you some theoretical framings to use them as markers to help with sense making, and also provide, hopefully, opportunities for engagement of a number of different ways so that we can co-design and move forward. And we're about to move into the first bit of interaction. Many of you around Sydney will probably have seen the soft toys, or maybe you're also placing soft toys in your windows, which I think is this lovely way of trying to tap into a sense of humanity in the midst of a crisis. And I know in my neighborhood, it gives me great delight when I hear young children going by and counting how many soft toys I have in my window and how they change and move. I was taken today that one of the statements that the Premier made about how the lockdown might start slowing down or easing up or relaxing, whatever language you want to use, she said it's a matter of trust. So the extent to which the lockdown is released has to do with how much trust is demonstrated by residents, by people trying to, as you often hear, do the right thing. And I have here this quote from Richard Edelman, who's the CEO of a company that puts out a trust barometer, and I'm going to share a few reports of that through the next period that we're spending together. And I just like this quote here, that trust today is granted on 2 distinct attributes: competence, which is about delivering on your promises, and ethical behavior, which is doing the right thing and working to improve society. And his argument is that it's no longer a matter of what you do, it's also how you do it. So these 2 are intertwined. And this is one of the running themes as we go through this next period together. So this is where I'd like to turn the controls over to Mark so that he can share with you a poll that we've put together to ask your thoughts about ways that you evaluate the trustworthiness of people as well as organizations. So Mark, if you're there, the floor or the buttons are yours.
Thank you, Teresa. So if you have a look in your chat window, you'll see a link which I've just posted to the poll. You could click on that link, please. It should take you to a survey, quick survey, and I'll post the results on the screen when we start getting some results through.
So I'll give you a little time to look at that. Oops.
So we have 13 responses. That's about a third of our attendees so far,
Okay.
Jumping up rapidly.
So are we seeing any differences between individuals and organizations? Verity, feel free to jump in and make some comments, any observations.
I will.
If you could just explain what the orange colours mean versus the blue colours, the blue shades.
Right, so these are the ranges. So it's effectively a Likert scale, just asking you to select these various dimensions, and the dimensions have been drawn from different reports on the criteria or the dimensions of trust and trustworthiness. And without getting into a big debate about all the different perspectives, we've gone with the range of not important at all, and those are the oranges and the reds. So if you see red, that is effectively not at all important or not selected. Unimportant is orange. Somewhat important is light blue, and extremely important is dark blue. And so what we're seeing, what it looks like, is that there are slight differences in terms of judging for an organization as opposed to an individual around legitimacy and authority.
Which is why we were interested in actually asking both questions about whether there were differences between the trustworthiness of an individual versus the trustworthiness of an organisation.
So we have 25 responses in there, so that's quite, that gives us a good sense of where that goes. And okay, so motive, I'm just trying to look on my screen to see, yeah. And transparency, yeah. And to follow on from the conversation yesterday, obviously when trust is a very subjective observation, and we could spend 2 hours discussing each one of these dimensions and whether or not we should have selected them this way. We also deliberately tried to mix up the order in which you would be seeing them, so as to try to diminish a presentation order effect. But as a good social scientist, I should flag we weren't trying to devise this in a way to be statistically significant. It was more just as a starter to get a sense of where we sit on this perspective. So, and we'll keep that open and put those results in the shared Google Doc as well. So there might also be an opportunity for people to make some comments about what they think about why they made the decisions that they did, and the points. So I'll go back to my talk now. And as Verity commented, and as it's hard to ignore listening to the reports of the last few days, one of the points or the issues that is coming up quite a lot now in the last week or so is this question of contact tracing because of COVID-19 and how to manage this. And there are any number of documents and rapid reviews that are being produced. Here is a collection from the UK, and I can highly recommend, generally every Friday, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics has been doing webinars, so it's our Friday evening, and they've been really engaging to discuss the various ethical and technical issues around this. And I've just pulled an extract from this rapid evidence review that was produced on the 20th of April, because I think, again, it's important in terms of what we're talking about here. So effective deployment of technology to support the transition from the crisis will be contingent on public trust and confidence, which can be strengthened through the establishment of 2 accountability mechanisms. So I think, sorry, that noise is my cat deciding that she's very interested in the issues of COVID-19 as well. So this idea of public trust being critical, it's not just about the technical, there are ethical considerations as well. But trust is a term that's used a lot. So what is trust? Trust is seen as a crucial element in government. And again, without getting into great detail about the benefits or the limitations of certain definitions, I quite like this broad notion that there are 2 different ways that trust is a crucial element of government. One is this idea of, do we trust government or do we trust the people in it? And that connects very much to trustworthiness. The second one is government as a public trust, where people holding a public office are required to act in the interests of the public as opposed to their self-interest. And so here's this extract from the public trust doctrine out of Canberra, that public office is a public trust, and therefore the people of Australia are entitled to expect, as a matter of principle, that ministers are going to act with due regard for integrity, fairness, accountability, responsibility, and the public interest. So again, these are principles being used to define a principle. What do we mean by integrity, fairness, accountability? Accountability to whom? Responsibility to whom? For what? These are the challenges that we face. I'm not going to discuss these from a legal standpoint, but presenting this to you in terms of a phenomenon in society, trust is very critical for underpinning the social order. And there's this very interesting work that has been done by Nyland looking at CCTV cameras in the UK. And it was a rich ethnographic social informatics perspective on this. And I'm going to give you a few examples of that in a little while. But I really like this quote: "Trust underpins or makes possible social action, and it makes possible expectations of consistent future social action, rendering a social order possible and meaningful." So it's to trust that the mechanisms by which we are demonstrating trust or trustworthiness are going to keep some form of order. And so very often what we see in terms of the way that trust is enacted is that it's enacted through both breaches and repairs. So you're testing the waters, and I suppose any parent knows how a child will test the boundaries of how far they can go. And it's only when there is a breach that one recognizes one has gone too far. And then it's about how one repairs that. So I want to draw attention to this dynamism that's inherent in this, that as important as it is to set conditions and to create laws, this is also a moving concept.
Teresa, it's just
Yes.
been raised on the chat. The little tiled window that you have is blocking some of that
Oh,
content.
so sorry. Darn. Yeah, sorry. I just realized. Sorry.
Thank
Yeah. Apologies for that. I keep forgetting how much you all see. Yes.
And if you could just edit out that "done" from the recording, thanks,
Yes.
Mark.
Sorry.
Consider it done.
Right. So trust is important, but why does it matter? Regardless of what definition. And I really like this, again, coming from the Edelman Trust Management, this idea that reputation is more backward looking as a concept and more about outcomes, whereas trust is about moving forward. It's about a projection. And so thinking about trust as a powerful KPI that is forward looking and predictive. It's also about relationships. So if we're talking about whether or not we find an individual trustworthy, that is in a relationship, and that is at a very personal level. And then at the organizational, we are still thinking about relationships, and I'm going to argue that they're still ultimately local as well. And I also think that trust and risk go hand in hand. So the more trust there is, the more risk is going to be accepted. And these words are going to permeate the next period that we're discussing this, because I think that it's really critical that we see trust, risk, and resilience together. So that building trust is really critical if we're going to create a resilient society. And resilience is about being able to handle challenges, to be able to manage risks, to also learn from mistakes. And that was something that came up yesterday in the conversations as well. So I'm going to make a series of propositions in this masterclass for us to discuss and engage with. And the first one is that trust building is personal, local, and political. Again, Verity set us off really well with the story from her perspective, and looking at an example from the 19th century. And I'm going to give you another example from the 19th century in a moment, but I'm going to start with this snapshot from the Edelman Trust Barometer from this year. And you can follow the links that are in the PDF version of these slides as well. So the the Edelman Trust Barometer looks effectively at these 4 categories, these 4 dimensions of trust: ability, dependability, integrity, and purpose. And these are just some extracts from this year's report that I found interesting. So the idea that employees expect to be heard, that, again, regardless of the view that we have of our organization, it is the contact in the office, it is the contact at the local that becomes critical. I think there's also an interesting opportunity here to talk about public trust and ways of handling crisis, not just at a global level or at a national level, but also at the local neighborhood level, at the local level of the LGA. Because again, it's very interesting to see internationally the difference between trust at the local level and trust at larger levels. And that, I think, has something to do with the fact that it is, that we are human, and particularly at moments of crisis, we really tap into the essence of humanity. So now I'm going to tell my little 19th century story of infection, and this is about Ignaz Semmelweis. So Semmelweis was a doctor at a hospital in Vienna. He's seen as the father of infection control and hand hygiene, and it's really interesting. If you want to, there's some great podcasts and historical studies about his life as a doctor, but also the trauma that he went through. I mean, in the end, he went mad, and he had quite a difficult time at the end of his life. What I want to draw attention to here, just in terms of how he sought to resolve a problem in the hospital where he was working in Vienna. The method that he used, this idea of recognize, explain, act, is an approach that is inherent in the practices in many encounters, as the one we're facing now, where you encounter a challenge or a difficulty. First, you have to try to recognize what the problem is. Then you test the waters, and there were a number of trial and error explorations in Semmelweis's encounter with infection in his hospital as well. There were different things that he thought could account for what was happening with the deaths in one wing of the hospital being so much higher than in the other. And it was only through trial and error that he ultimately identified the fact that hand washing at a higher level of extreme action made the difference, because the surgeons and the interns who were going from autopsies into the hospital to help with the delivery of babies were carrying, initially it was thought they were disease particles, and ultimately he worked out that using this new approach that he could reduce, and he did dramatically reduce the deaths down to less than 1% through his method. Sadly, he had the greatest difficulty convincing the people he worked with about the benefits of continuing with his procedure. Some of them did it in the early days, but it was really difficult, it was tedious, it was onerous. And because he hadn't had very good work relationships with the people around him, he wasn't respected. It's very similar to the situation of the cholera epidemic in London. Again, there was a personal connection that was lacking in this case, that in the end meant that his method, no matter how successful, was not deployed. So I want to use this illustration as a way to put to you an idea about 4 quadrants in which we can build trust: resilience, reassurance, relationships, and reflection. Connections and communication and professionalism, I see this as the competence, as the expertise that in the case of Semmelweis, but also in the case of COVID-19, we're seeing people speaking about expertise and being reassured when the evidence of the experts is provided. But it's also about relationships, building and maintaining those connections and being able to understand the value at that local level. And in Semmelweis's case, even though scientifically it has been demonstrated, and he demonstrated that what he was doing was appropriate and and delivered results. It was saving lives. He was able to do that through the new intervention that he created. But because he didn't have relationships with the other colleagues in his hospital, he ended up not being able to put his new initiatives into enduring effect. The other thing that I draw out of both that example and other examples of innovation is the necessity for resilience, to be persistent. So it was a period of trial and error, and it took thinking and curiosity and persistence and tenacity. And I'm going to come back to that in the second half of this masterclass. And then the fourth thing is making time to think and test. And it is this reflective element that I want us to think about right now. So this is a chance where, again, I think if I open this, if I can put this link into, or do you have the link, Mark? How are we going to drive this? So you should be able to put the link into the chat.
If you could put that link into the chat there, Teresa,
Yep.
that'd be great.
Yep. So now, because I have my screen off. Oh. Okay.
That's all right. I think I have it. I'll pop it into
You
the
have
chat.
it? Great. Okay. So now I'm going to bring the Google Doc up. So if anyone is having difficulty getting into this Google document, then please use the chat window and put some comments in the chat side, and then Mark will help us to populate this. And again, this is a living document. We'll keep this open not just for this session, but for the next few days. So you know, I can hardly ask you to make some time to think and then not give you a lot of time to think. But I want to get started in this and see what kinds of responses we can collect from this rich community of experts about experiences of trust in crisis that we've had. Not just situations where it has worked well, but if we have the luxury of hindsight, as we do for the moment, to think about examples where there was no trust or there was a breach of trust, or if you feel you can think of an example where there was no effort made to gain or maintain trust, and the detrimental consequences of that, if there were any, then it would be interesting to see populated as well. And most critically, the lessons that we could learn from this. Okay, so car accidents, that's quite a... Are there any coming up in the chat window?
No, nothing in the chat.
Okay. Okay.
People just adding into the document.
If anyone is having difficulty accessing that, can you just please make a comment in the chat so that we know, and then we can try to help? I'll give a few more minutes for people to write, and then I'm going to ask some of the authors to expand on what they're saying. tell you, webinars are much quieter than face-to-face sessions when everyone's busy typing. So while people are typing, can I ask? It's interesting. So we have, as I hoped would happen, so we have an exemplar giving birth, a situation that worked well, and also giving birth, a situation that did not work well. And it would be interesting to hear, are the authors of those willing to share a little more about that? You don't have to feel obliged. If you would like to, then I'd be interested to take this opportunity to maybe look at the ways of navigating that challenge of
It's Lyria here. I was the negative one. I reacted to the positive one and felt I had to say, you know, the other side of it. So this was a situation where I had said I didn't want an epidural, and the person, whatever, the anesthesiologist was like, well, of course you're going to change your mind. You know, can't I just do it now because I really want to go home? You know, and it was just, you know, whatever. And I didn't change my mind, for the record. But even if I had changed my mind, or most people change their minds, or whatever, it was just very dismissive of where, you know, of where I was at that moment.
Yeah. Now, was that not a midwife then?
No, it was the anaesthetist, I think. You know, the person who does the epidurals.
Yeah. Yeah. So possibly different. I would say, I mean, talking like an academic, different paradigms, different ways of operating.
Maybe, although I think, you know, the medical profession normally you'd think would be, you know, good at communicating with patients, but it was definitely a very, it was like he knew better kind of approach. And I don't think the I know better approach, or I know what you're really going to decide later kind of approach really helps build trust.
I think that to me, that flags that challenge about not that it should be attention, but it's one thing to be expert and have expertise, and certainly in situations where you want someone to be able to act decisively and have authority, but you want them to also be very capable of appreciating your vulnerability and the fact that you are in need of humans reaching out to you. So I hear someone typing.
So I was the one that's very here. Someone who,
hi. Yeah.
I sort of, you know, sharing your childbirth stories with a group of old, well, that is trust. But I was wonderful. The positive childbirth story. And I think that listening to Illyria, I was thinking mine was sort of the complete opposite. And whether or not they were humouring me at the time, and admittedly, I was lucky. I was in a birth centre at RPA with a midwife, and I had the same midwife throughout the whole birth and all of that sort of stuff. So a sort of relationship built between us. Yeah. And whether or not she was humouring me, which I suspect at points she was, I never felt she was. And so there was this sense that I was in control of the situation and that my needs were being met and listened to. Yeah. And I said this, which again, I wouldn't have necessarily said if I knew I was going to be identified. There was this weird sense of gender solidarity. So this sense that she must know what I'm going through because she too is a woman who has had children. Right. So there's that mixture between medical competence, like believing in her medical training and competence. I totally believed in that, but I had this also weird sense of connection due to the fact that she must know what it's like personally.
Yeah. I think empathy as well as expertise in those situations. And I mean, not having been trained as a medical doctor, but having been in many different medical contexts, I have, as a patient, experienced different levels of empathy, and it makes such a difference. But there's also, again, these are local relationships. There are different personalities that are at play on both sides, and in a situation where you need action right there and then. So the car accident is another example. We're talking risk, we're talking vulnerability. If it's out of your comfort zone and out of your area of expertise, you're in need of someone to be able to assist and to know what to do. There's also this risk that if they are not doing it the right way, something could go wrong with detrimental consequences. So how can they speak with authority but not mislead? So let's just see. These are all really, really good. Stop the waffle. It was little. Yeah. Okay. Clear. Yes. Avoid jargon. And that comes down to training. That's something I want to get to in terms of how you build trust from the inside out, and codes of professionalism. Let's see. Zoom used to. Yeah, respond. So down here, in terms of the clear plan of action to address concerns, does the person or persons who've contributed to this, or let me say, you don't have to, maybe you haven't authored this, but you can relate to this. Would anyone like to make some comment about this one, about Zoom use during COVID? And particularly this idea about how this was handled. The clear plan of action to address concerns. I'd be interested to know, was that something that was in place at the start, or was that something that had to be put in place after issues became apparent? People are so busy writing. It's great. Okay, I might, if it's Verity, what do you think? Should we let people write a little more? Do you see another example that you'd like to discuss, or should we carry on a little bit?
Sorry, I was muted.
That's okay. Oh, that's okay.
I mean, there's some good examples in there. My health records, interesting.
Yes.
In terms of, particularly in the light of the COVID app that's now being rolled out, like what went wrong in my health record rollout, because it really did go wrong. And if you're going to use the Zoom thing, I agree with you. I think Zoom, like in response to trust issues, altered their behaviour. And that's what they attempted to do with my health record as well, but it didn't work.
Yeah, so I'm highlighting a few things here. So I think that idea about the mechanisms that confer trustworthiness is critical. An emergency. Yeah, this one here, the last one on. Here we are. Thinking about the person you're communicating to, I actually was part of a collaborative autoethnography with people dealing with emergency situations, and that challenge of the authority that was being, in a sense, thrown at you without an understanding of the experience of being in that room and that space. Shifting the narrative, okay, because it's particularly, I think, when mistakes will happen, and as a social informaticist, we know this, that when anything is released into the wild, particularly when it involves people and technology, things will not go as planned. They very rarely do. And it becomes really critical to understand how to have some sort of safety nets in place, how to learn to not repeat the same mistakes, how to develop the maturity to be able to admit to your mistakes. And I think that goes back to the relationship building as well. So that sometimes, and I know this came up in some of our conversation yesterday, that if you're in a situation where it is detrimental to your position to admit a mistake or a failure, that's not to say you want everyone going around making mistakes all the time, but how do we learn and not repeat the failures of the past if we don't create better trust relationships within professions?
Mm. Mm.
Okay, so I might, welfare, these are all really, really good. What's our time? I'm just very mindful. I might just go, oops, have I done the wrong thing? This is where it's like walking and chewing gum. Now if I can, yeah, okay. Okay, so I think that was one of the examples I wanted to flag. Ooh, where did I go? Oh, yeah, okay. So one other thing to learn from the failures is that when there's a loss of trust or a break in trust, it's problematic. And increasingly what we see discussed at the moment is what's called a trust deficit. And I just want to take a moment to think about the current trust deficit and how we got here, why it is critical to learn from this, and how we might move forward and learn from this. So you're seeing reference to mistrust in terms of the way that digital data is being used to deal with the pandemic. Here's just one example of a paper reporting on the challenges around privacy and public trust. Again, everyone will have different ways of wording this or defining this, but it is interesting that the risk of mistrust is unsurprisingly greater in those countries where people have a lower level of trust in their government. And so then it becomes very difficult to have a proportional response that is measured, that communicates effectively, and that can deal with this crisis. And we're actually seeing that play out. I mean, this photo from the United States, I could spend ages just unpacking this because it's just very interesting how this imagery has shifted from the language of someone who might be have a more liberal set of politics to someone who's now on the other side of the floor, so to speak. And again, going to Nyland, who has looked at trust and surveillance, I think it's very interesting to just think about the fluidity of these concepts, and that even at any one moment in time, they are not universal or stable concepts. And so you might see privacy and trust used in terms of a protective metaphor. We might see it in terms of mistrust. And at the moment, it's increasingly evident that societal leaders are not being trusted to address the challenges. And that came out in some of the comments in the Google Doc list that we were just playing with or working with. I mean that in a very good way. So there's a lot of talk about the challenge to the social contract, the agreement, whether it's implicit or explicit, that government will work for the public and with the public interest in mind. And so here are just a few snapshots in relation to COVID-19 of business reports about managing the crisis and the necessity to now take this seriously because of the power shifts that are starting to really show their teeth, for lack of another term. And trust, as I said, connecting to risk and resilience, dealing with innovation, the fact that so often we're talking about data and technologies as well. I think this is another illustration of why it is so important that we be talking about the mechanisms that we can put in place for building trust. So that if trust is very fluid, we're not talking about having it in some fixed form, but understanding that it is this precious living entity, this living organic form, and that we have to be finding ways to be able to put mechanisms in place that allow us to nurture this and to evaluate when mistakes have been made and to learn from those mistakes. So that raises that question of whether there is in fact a moral social obligation for governments and for leaders to start to give reassurance and to provide evidence as to the reasoning behind those reassurances about the controls and the processes that are in place. I have my own theory about why I think there's this trust deficit, and I just want to flag this because I think, again, because we're talking about data technologies, often we're talking about socio-technical contexts where there are humans and machines at play. I have this sense at the moment that we're in a sort of a trough of disillusionment with data, and that I say this as someone who works with data and who trains data scientists. It's not that data is problematic, but that I feel that in some ways we've been putting so much emphasis and attention into the competencies around working with the data and improving the mechanisms for dealing with that data, that understanding that other side, that empathic side, understanding the human features of decisioning has not been given the same attention. And so I think it's no surprise that we get situations like the doomsday clock very symbolically being moved to 100 seconds to midnight early this year, not just because of the threat of nuclear conflict, not just because of climate change and the challenges that we face globally because of that, but also because of the inability of decision makers to act. And that was then further emphasized just a few weeks ago by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And this is a group that stems from the Manhattan Project, so dealing with a crisis of another order in the last century. And so I think there's some lessons to learn from that. And I've highlighted one point that I particularly like in the most recent statement on the 15th of April about the doomsday clock and dealing with COVID-19 globally. In short, as the world is now seeing, government dysfunction can cost lives. Competent, timely actions to prevent and mitigate future global crises, whether they're biological, nuclear, climatic, or of another kind, will depend on the world's ability to address three fundamental governance concerns. So we're talking governance, and within governance, I'm going to argue there's an ethical responsibility to engage in discussions about values. And I want to give a snapshot briefly, looking at the bushfire crises that we recently experienced in Australia. And to me, this is an illustration of the challenge of acting, taking action in the face of uncertainty and the fluidity of knowledge when data representations cannot keep up. And this was similar, this goes back to Semmelweis, this goes back to the issues with understanding the cholera epidemic. When in the midst of a crisis where your understanding of the situation is changing rapidly and dynamically, and you're creating knowledge as this crisis unfolds, you're struggling to keep up with ways of making sense of this new information in light of what it is that you already know. Now, as an information scientist and someone who has studied how we generate ideas and if you like, the politics of knowledge, it's pretty clear information is always going to be imperfect, and you're still going to have to act. And I see this stories like the one that I have here about the challenges with the modeling that were discussed at the time as illustration of this. So in the midst of this, trying to do data modeling to understand fire behavior was proving very difficult. It was the fires, as I said, the blazes were of such a scale that their behavior was not consistent with the modeling. That oversimplifies to some extent what was going on. But the point I want to raise out of this is that people on the ground people at the local level were experiencing it in a very different way, and were able to, in some ways, read the experience, not just because of the data that existed in the modeling systems that they were using, but because of the knowledge that they had built up in their bodies and through their experience, years of working in the field. And that's how we as humans learn to make decisions in the face of uncertainty. And my worry is, as someone who's worked in education, training data scientists, is that we work so hard on the mechanisms for dealing with the technical aspect of decisioning. And if we're losing sight of the human side of that, if we're losing sight of the way that we cognitively and emotionally make decisions, then to me, there's no surprise when I see that there's an erosion of trust, because at the local level, humans still need to understand how humans are working with other humans. Now we see this, here's this interesting story from the conversation that talked in light of the Australian, in the aftermath of the bushfires, seeing the decline in confidence, public confidence in institutions. But what was also apparent is that there were very favorable reactions towards people and organizations responsible for fighting fires in the rural and regional areas. And I've been doing a little bit of work on this for the CoData community, where I've been exploring resilience. And I was up in Port Macquarie looking at the aftermaths of the fires there. And then here again, I'm just trying to understand it as more as a social phenomenon, to see how people come out of crisis, and looking at the issues of resilience. And I found it really interesting, the artworks that were popping up everywhere as tributes to the firefighters. And I think that says something about how important you are to a community when, and we know, we've seen the stories about the thanks that were given and are still being conveyed to that community. And so I think there's a lesson there about building trust at that local level. And that building trust involves working within the community and for it as well. So that if you're not inside there accepting the risk and the responsibility and being accountable in that way, then it is much harder to build trust. And I've connected some of this work to understanding ways of gaining, we don't use that term anymore, but the idea of gaining social license, how it is that you can demonstrate trustworthiness when you're working with data. So this is some work that I've been doing, and I talked about this last year in connection to working on AI ethics. What I just want to flag here is that, again, trust in this case is not a singular target that you're meeting. It's an ongoing process, and you don't start with trust. You have to work towards gaining that trust. So you have to establish your legitimacy. You have to then be accepted, continue to establish your credibility, move through trust. And I would argue that ultimately, if local is where we get our greatest power in terms of building trust and demonstrating trust, then we need more participatory engagement. So this is a good time to now turn to another activity and build. I'm going to model this on what was done so brilliantly at the halfway mark yesterday as well, and turn over to the next Google Doc. Well, so you'll see it's on the same one. So if you go further down the document that we started a short time ago, you'll see there's another one where I want us to think about learning from breaches and repairs of trust. So this extends this a little bit to think about the different ways that we can specifically explore trust in relation to privacy. And I'll use this also as an opportunity for people to take a quick break, to leave their screens. What was it that was said yesterday? Put the kettle on, or take a comfort break. And we'll come back at 7:04. So I'll give you 5 minutes if that's good. How does that sound?
Sounds very generous.
Okay. I have to try to keep human, you see.
It's a great idea.
But I'll stay on the mic if anybody is not leaving and wants to talk about anything that's been put in the screen thus far, put in the document. I think this is a good one.
It's Malcolm here. Teresa, can you hear me or not?
Hi, Malcolm. Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Following sort of stalking or whatever it is in this kind of situation. Strange behaviour. I think you might have said it impliedly, but it's worthwhile drawing it out with regard to the COVID Safe app in that, you know, I would give the government, say, C+ for what it's done so far. And you know, I'm doing some work with other people on the extra things that they really still need to do. And they're still doing an awful lot of hand waving. The determination, for example, doesn't address properly at all the fact that common law doesn't apply to state agencies. Full stop, end of story. Why does the determination and the surrounding wording of the determination only talk about law enforcement? Complete silence on another concept that is very separate, which is national security. Now, in another circumstance, if there was less of a, this is actually my point, in another circumstance, if there was less of a trust deficit, you probably wouldn't be doing such technical analysis and trying to find all the holes and why have they used weasel words and what are the weasel words and where they are. So the amount of work that the government now has to do to get enough trust depends on its current state of play. You know, what is the scale of the trust deficit? And I think we probably in your tables, as opposed to what you were saying, haven't quite captured that relationship between the inherent trust that there is. And the other one is our risk appetite changes rapidly depending on the existence or lack of existence of that crisis.
Yep.
You know, stand back, I'm a doctor, at a car accident will be accepted. You walk up to somebody in the street and say, gee, I've got this itch. And the person says, well, actually, I'm a doctor, I can help you. You'd probably say, thanks, but no thanks. Even though I think we've probably got to put a bit more effort on context matters.
Yep.
Both in terms of context created by crisis and context of past behaviour. I don't know how to quite capture that in your table, that's all.
No. And yeah, this is always the difficulty trying to work out the order of discussing these things. But I have a smile on my face because you've hit right on the head something that's coming up as my next proposition.
I'm sorry.
No, that's great because this is about trying to offer ideas and get feedback as to whether or not this is an appropriate way to go. So what you're saying is just amplifying that indeed risk, you know, the context of the risk, the context within which the trust relationship is being challenged or tested has a great impact. And I feel very, very strongly that it's always best to have these trust relationships in a healthy state before you get the crisis.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right, because it's there's a lot more nuance to discuss when you're comfortable in an environment. So you're not going to just be nitpicking, or again, if you think about the way that a personal trust relationship is built, there are people that will not even have to finish a sentence who are very close to you. You understand enough of the context and you trust that, you know, even if our words are not exactly the same, there'll be enough of an understanding, but also a mechanism in place that allows for you to repair any misunderstanding with enough time to not destroy the relationship. Sorry?
That's an example of fast feedback loops. And the speed of the feedback loop operating actually changes how you go about trusting.
Yeah.
So, you know, if for example, even in, say, a Twitter engagement, one of the problems government has is that Twitter moves at speeds measured in seconds and minutes. If the department is only going to allow its spokesperson to respond after 2 days of bashing around the draft response in 180 words, they've completely missed the point. The draft response might be perfect. It's just irrelevant by the time it's put out. The other point that I think that is related to that is, in fact, relationship. That if, you know, sometimes trust builds from qualifications, like, you know, with doctors and so forth, but sometimes it depends, as we say, on history, which is part of what you've done, so that, you know, I share something with you that is not too threatening, but nevertheless implies there's a trust in you, and you behave appropriately with that information, and you might even say something back to me that, you know, again, is something that's just between the two of us. It doesn't really matter if it leaks, and so you're sort of climbing a little ladder of trust through the interactions. In other words, it's another way from simply, you know, having credentials or other mechanisms in place for dealing with things. I'm just thinking of all the different ways in which you build trust.
No, exactly. So I think that's a lovely segue to go into proposition number 2. Hopefully everyone's been able to get a drink and just have a stretch. And I could see people still typing. So it is still really unnerving. I mean, I've worked in e-learning before, but it is still so unnerving staring at my screen, knowing people are typing and hopefully still listening. So as we were just saying in the conversation, for those of you who maybe were still with us and not having left, it's always easier to build trust prior to a crisis. So if you're trying to build trust in the midst of a crisis, you're going to run into difficulty. And I want to unpack this a little bit based on some work that I've been doing around the relationship between uncertainty, risk, and creativity. So for about 10 years now, I've been looking at the phenomenon of risk appetites. I've been looking at risk anthropologically and connecting that to the different ways that we engage with information and technology. And there's a few components to that for me are a baseline in all of this. One aspect is about building trust and mitigating risk and how critical those are for actually enabling the resilience in our society. So I talk about the 4 phase states of innovation culture, and I deal with this at an individual and at an organizational level. So I'm not going to talk about those here, but if you are interested in that, there's the link to one of the original papers about that. And we can talk about that afterwards as well. This is also where you're dealing with the uncertainty of incomplete data. And to me, that's a part of the play element, and that connects to the risk appetite that you have, the disposition towards risk, both individually and organizationally or culturally. There's also a need to find a way to develop an appreciation for complexity while remaining focused on a local context. So that's that think globally, act locally mantra. I also see it very evident in Indigenous practices, Indigenous knowledge, and Indigenous science. And while that's not an area that I have any authority to speak in, I am so excited to see the way that language is being brought in, and that people are recognizing that there is learning to be had by understanding old ways and bringing them into new contexts. And to do that appropriately, we also need to pause. And so this runs a little contradictory to what we were just talking about a moment ago, Malcolm, because in those fast feedback loops, sometimes the speed at which we are trying to learn and we are compelled to learn does not allow us to pause. And without making some time to think and without constructing the opportunities for thinking, it is very difficult to learn from the mistakes of the past so that you don't repeat them. So that pause has to be seen, that has to be privileged as a critical design mechanism, not as a luxury. So on that aspect, so I've been looking for the longest time at the positive potential of risk and uncertainty. And now, as a consequence of some of the work that Ian had asked me to start doing around social license and trust a few years ago, I've started examining the other side of that equation, which I'm sorry to say I was so caught up in looking at the positive potentials that it had pulled me a little bit away from the relationship between perceptions of vulnerability and uncertainty and the need for demonstrating trustworthiness. And so I think there is this relationship here, and we see that in times of crisis particularly. So around the bushfire crisis, people who are feeling that their data might be used inappropriately, when you have both a high sense of vulnerability, a loss of control, and a lot of uncertainty about the future, then you have an even higher need to have trustworthiness demonstrated for you. And so at the moment, I'm theorizing around the locating trust and the building of trust within this notion of a resilient ecology. So that if you're trying to enable the creativity and the innovation of your community, as well as ensure that you are protecting the vulnerable, then really we are getting at the essence of a resilient ecology. And so I've been playing with this fractal notion of the different components. This is just the representation in terms of AI and automated decision making. And you can see I like putting things together with some sort of alliteration. So the community, the civility, the communication, connection, and commitment are all really critical to that. And to me, these are ways of establishing the foundation within which trust can be nurtured. So it's not about having a checkbox where you say, right, have trust out of the way. Trust is grown. Trust can be nurtured and cultured, but it comes through from all these different aspects of the fractal. And so to be worthy of trust is more about just having the authority. And so to me, this then gets us into the issues of governance and the ways at a federal level, at a local level, at a familial level, we can develop a way to be good partners, to be better humans with the people around us. So that's not just about authority. And I really like seeing, particularly in the last few weeks, a lot more talk about listening. And so this is just a quote from one story a few weeks ago. Those who are able to inspire trust, whether they are individuals, corporations, or states, will be the big winners when the dust settles. The world has too many leaders and not enough statesmen. And in this age of confusion, those who can rise above the individual and factional interests will be the real winners. Now, that's an ideal. But I think it flags that listening is learning and leading. And I have here two illustrations of the different ways that this can be done at an organizational, institutional, and at an individual level. And you can follow those links in your own time and explore them. There are many different ways that this sort of modeling of listening presents itself. So I have very often in the training that I've designed talked about hindsight, insight, and foresight, and the oversight that can come from that. So this is a formal representation of that from the Cranfield group. It need not be that formal, but I think this is where taking those moments of pause to reflect more deeply and more richly on experiences of the past, both success stories, but also those moments of crisis or those places where things have not gone according to plan, to deeply interrogate that past, to understand, it's to listen to the past and to ensure that you're listening to enough angles about that past. That then can shape a richer insight into your present that can also then enable better action for the future. So that brings me to my third proposition, which is that to build public trust, I think it's best enabled when we are in pursuit of a shared understanding of well-being. And when that well-being imperative drives our ethics, then we are setting the conditions for trust building. So I'm going to go back to these 4 R's, if you like. So some have reading, writing, arithmetic, and reflection. So I have reassurance, resilience, relationships, and reflection. And I think one way of building public trust. This is my proposition to you, and I would like, hopefully in the time that we have together this afternoon, early evening, to explore whether you see this as a valuable way, almost a heuristic, if you like, for trying to help build the foundation upon which mechanisms for trust building can be established. So reassurance, if we are focused on well-being, is about repairing first and foremost the trust deficit in our societies. And there, we're going to talk about this a little more deeply in a moment. I think that we need to draw very deeply on the markers of the democratic process. We're not just talking about a nation state in a generic sense. We presumably all hold dear a value, the democratic values. Some of this came out yesterday, so I was very excited to see that. And hopefully Kim and Peter and a group of others who were talking about this yesterday will then share some of that in our conversation. I also see this as connected to the German notion of Bildung, because a democratic process is not just about telling citizens that you have the right experts in place. It's about educating your citizens and training them to be capable of making decisions and partnering with you in those decisions. And that's the relationship building as well. So that puts that expertise in context. And you need those rich relationships, because every single one of the problems that we are tackling, every single the ones that I saw being built on those tables that you're helping to put together in the Google document, there's a wickedness to all of those. So they are not straightforward. There's a complexity there that requires of us diversity and inclusivity, so that we have the different angles and perspectives that come from the many voices of many different kinds of experts and many different types of expertise, not just technical, not just social, not just political, but the expertise of living and trying to survive and thrive. And that again is another way of thinking of resilience and the notions of flourishing and encouraging curiosity and courage and that risk appetite. And then again, I come back to reflection and making the time to think and to learn from success and from failure. And so that requires education, the training, not just skills training, but also in terms of some of those core empathic qualities of being human. I think we need to make more time to be learning how to be human and to be civil with one another and create a true civil society. And so to this, in this way, I think there's some really valuable operating principles for demonstrating trustworthiness that we can draw from Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance. And again, I have had the great privilege of starting to work with people in this community within CODATA and the International Science Council. But I'm not an expert in this, and if there is anyone in participating this afternoon who has more direct experience with this, I'd love to hear from you about this. But it really resonates with me, the language from people like Carol, this particular paper about Indigenous data governance. Core values of reciprocity and stewardship are of higher priority than efficiency and economic growth. That sounds like a great baseline for building trust. So if well-being determines the ethics of our system, then governance needs to be in the service of the community's foundational capacity to make and implement strategic decisions about their own affairs. So you can, fill in this blank. COVID tracker apps, data about managing the life cycle of children, understanding the insurance needs of your community, thinking about surveillance that you're needing to put into the position within a local town area for safety reasons. So that idea of the kind of data artifacts, and data is not just the traditional views of data. So again, I think we humans are amazing data collecting instruments or organisms. And there's a lot of data that comes from the insight of intuitive understanding that we have not been training ourselves to understand enough and appreciate. And so if we start thinking more about this care approach and being more interdependent, more appreciative of individual and collective ways of understanding, dealing with the language of stewardship and focusing on relations, then maybe we'll be starting to govern more effectively and putting governance approaches in that will help us to then identify a shared appreciation of what we mean by accurate and relevant and timely, because again, these are very varied notions. And I think the other reason, just going back for a moment to the Edelman Trust Barometer, I think there's a lot of, I don't think you need data to tell you this. I think a lot of us have experienced this. I don't think there's any one place where one individual or one organization can know everything or can be seen to have the most experience or the most, the only expertise or the sole expertise. And so the perceptions of trust are showing this out as well, that of the four broad clusters of institutions that the Edelman Trust Barometer looked at, no singular institution was seen as both competent and ethical. And I guess unsurprisingly, government and media were perceived by the general public as being both incompetent and unethical. But where there were ethical and competent partnerships, or where there were ethical and competent institutions, it was because they were working in partnership. So that tells us something about the value of working together to work collectively towards something. So now here's this next exercise, and this I would just like you to put into the chat, and then maybe Mark can read some of them out to me. We'll see, because I want to leave this up. What I have here are a number different post-its, if you like. I had to have post-its somewhere in an activity. Different terms that come to mind when people speak or write of global democracy and the fundamental principles of global democracy. So I would like to ask this very esteemed audience to finish this sentence. In a democratic society, trust means what? What does trust mean to you? So I'm not going to bring up the screen for, oh, actually everyone can see the screen anyway, so I'll go bring up the screen. Yeah, I saw, Malcolm, I just saw your request for more rows. Hopefully everyone can create, yes. Empathy, consent, yes. How you treat the minorities of the weak. Mm-hmm. Yes, okay. Respect, yes. Fairness. And so we hear this a lot, don't we? We hear a fair go. But what do we mean by fair? What does equal mean? What does respect? So one thing I want to put out there as a really critical one that I feel is this idea that, and this is my fourth and final proposition, that trust in a democratic society means giving inclusive voice to people and ideas. And that doesn't just mean one-way traffic. That is very two-way. And so this is my last blast from the past. I'm so excited that I have an excuse to quote Bertolt Brecht. And again, I do this. So Bertolt Brecht, if you want to talk about socio-technical histories, his piece on the radio as an apparatus of communication is lovely. I think I read this is early 20th century. This is a technology that is being explored at a time when you think about the 1930s and the 20th century, and you think what we now know about what happened in the 1940s. You think about the struggles that were going on in Europe at the time, and I feel this very acutely as the child of parents whose lives were shaped by the Second World War and by the beginning of the Cold War. So I think there's a lesson in democracy that we can draw by looking at the failed attempts at democracy of the early 20th century and the ways that new technologies of the day were being explored and being critiqued by people who were in the community as performers and who were trying to give voice to different aspects of society. So I just have this little quote here, that the radio would be the finest possible communication apparatus in public life, a vast network of pipes. And it would be if we knew how to receive as well as to transmit. how to let the listener speak as well as hear, how to bring him into a relationship instead of isolating him. And on this principle, the radio should step out of the supply business and organize its listeners as suppliers. Any attempt by the radio to give truly public character to public occasions is a step in the right direction. This is pre-social media. This is thinking about, let's just imagine what technology could do. And I see this as connected to the challenges that we have in dealing with the limitations and the powers of technology. So very often our technologies drive certain behaviors, not because they are preordained, but because they demand so much attention in one direction that it can be very hard for us to pull away from that. And there's the power pull can be mitigated if we have more diversity in the way that we are designing, and if we are more inclusive in the way that we are trying to get different voices heard, because then we will be more likely to pick up when someone is not in the loop, when someone is disenfranchised or disconnected. And I think in terms of technology, this is a really critical time for us to recognize the necessity for developing both competence and ethics in our society, in our citizens, in our professionals, in our governments. So again, these are just some snapshots from the Edelman Trust Barometer about the pace of change, this observation that government does not understand emerging technologies. And again, remembering that no institution is seen as both competent and ethical, but that dealing with technical challenges is going to require expertise as well as empathy. So you see lots of pushes, is that a word? Sorry, I started thinking German there for a moment. Dealing with ways of demonstrating public trust in technology. There are arguments about trust anchors. This is from KPMG's Guardians of Trust report. These are the 4 qualities that they try to put into the training that they put together as a way of demonstrating or putting the mechanisms for trust in place. This is a snapshot from the way that I sought to do this as the director of the Master of Data Science and Innovation. And it's something that I've sought to do in the ongoing training of data scientists. And that goes to this idea that professionalism cannot just be about developing our competencies, developing our expertise in the technical realm, but also developing a culture of professionalism that is about harnessing our humanity and understanding the responsibilities that we have for recognizing, uncovering, and addressing the missing, the underrepresented and misrepresented, not just dealing with what's in front of us, but trying to make the invisible visible, and to embrace those responsibilities, to interrogate the frameworks around us, to build new frameworks, and to take leadership roles. I think if we're doing this from the inside of organizations, we put ourselves in a more powerful position for actually starting to be worthy of trust. And so, you see the demonstrations, the arguments about ways of trying to maintain your obligations, particularly under crisis. But I think we're at a time where we need to start thinking about not just working from the inside out, but from the outside in. Thinking about what a new social contract for technology use could look like, and how we could start to define that social contract for something like this current conversation about the tracker app. How do we do that in line with trying to shape a collective understanding of the society that we want to live in, not just as citizens, but as designers of the technologies that citizens would be using, designers of the spaces and the governments and I guess the shared spaces. How are we doing on time? Verity, I feel like I want to turn the floor over to you for a while and see what you'd want to share on this. I don't know. I don't have the driver there. I'm not hearing you. Are you? Oh, there you go.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. I was just saying you're a hard act to follow, Teresa. It's been such a brilliant I've just been enjoying it so much. But I have been scribbling bits and pieces, and I have been watching a very intelligent chat go by. One of the things that I was thinking, as you said, and the problem is all of my, I'm worried my comments will appear incredibly cynical as a previous practitioner of politics, and I don't want to in any way add a cynical nature to this debate. But I think what you were saying about relationships and about the need for the public to trust government or to trust, to rebuild trust in our institutions. I think the relationship is the key there, because I think it's an absolutely two-way street. And I think what I found very depressing about when I was in politics was that, in fact, the lack of trust goes both ways. There is an enormous cynicism amongst the political class as well about whether or not there is a wisdom in the people. And some of that's just because they feel a bit beleaguered because they're always complained to. So there's, again, it's like an emotional response. If you're constantly, people are constantly berating you about what's going wrong, you become more cynical. But it is what worries me about the political class. They don't think there's a whole lot of wisdom out there, and in many ways. And so it's also about us opening their eyes to that collective wisdom. Or the other thing I was scribbling and also watching go past in the chats was, I think it's a very interesting case study, the COVID case study, and the way that expertise has once again appeared, other than in Trump's America, but expertise is once again forming a genuine part of the political conversation, and we're seeing governments act in an evidence way. But I think that, again, we've got to be cautious about being too excited too quickly. I think what Malcolm was saying about context is really important there. I think there's a difference between a health crisis, where there's sort of an automatic adoption that really there are a group of people who have the technical expertise to advise on this issue, and most others do not, and therefore we would be mad not to follow their technical expertise. And I don't think that necessarily extends into other areas where adherence to scientific evidence is just as important. I'm thinking things like climate change, for example, but where there are significant political, ideological and economic forces at play. So I think what we really need to do is draw all of the great examples of evidence-based decision-making that has occurred through COVID, and try to actually extrapolate the lessons from that to be able to apply to other serious, wicked problems.
Yeah, and before they get more wicked, I think that's very true. I'm mindful of the time. I'm going to share this. I lied when I said I wasn't going to give another historical example, because this is the last historical example. And this comes from Paul Duguid. So if anyone has read The Social Life of Information, you may have seen this. So again, John Seely Brown and Paul Duguid come from the classic Xerox PARC labs that were set up as, I think, a really lovely example of ways that technologists and anthropologists can partner together. And this story I've been using in classes for, ever since the book came out. And because we're talking cholera and crises, I thought it was interesting to flag that sometimes when we are seeking to solve a problem and we think we have a modern emerging technology way of resolving that problem, we can lose sight of what is missing by having used the old ways. And I don't mean to sound like some old traditionalist, because I'm not, but I do think that we often run the risk of losing the richness of insight that can come when we throw the old out in light of the new. So this little story here flags the fact that reading this correspondence about that was written at the time of the American Revolution, so the late 18th century. What was evident only when the second scholar came into the library to start reading was that if you sniffed the letters and you had a scent of vinegar, then you knew that cholera had existed in the town where the letter writer had lived. And so if the correspondent was saying that everything was fine, but the letter smelled of vinegar, then you knew that they were perhaps not telling the truth, but you knew that they were trying to protect themselves. So I, you could read this on a lot of different levels, but I metaphorically am interested in where the vinegar is in our current situation. What is it that we are missing? So when we are moving forward, because we have to, because of the urgencies and the need for efficiencies, and no one wants to be in this lockdown in this pandemic any longer than they need to, but we also know that the decisions that we make will have consequences. So how, knowing that knowledge is imperfect, how do you move forward? So I want to give one more case study example, and this is a 21st century one. So this is about surveillance, and this goes back to Nyland's work, and it's a really lovely book talking about this ethnographic exploration of the introduction of CCTV cameras in the UK, and exploring the different ways that this community handled this. And so the language that he's using here, and again, I'm very mindful, Verity, as you said, I didn't realize I was being so optimistic today in this, but I think there is space for trying to look at the way that new language might help us to appreciate the necessity to allow ourselves to explore these spaces in different ways. And that, again, trust is not going to happen overnight. And with technology, sometimes speed works against us. But if we can look at the different ways that sense is made in a particular space that is inhabited not just by humans, but by machines and by regimes and practices, and this, as he says, this complex interweaving of these issues. He's written this entire book just about the way that surveillance was put in place. And that's great when you have the luxury of hindsight to be able to look at this. But I do think that there's a lesson in this for us, because if we do take a team-based approach at this, while some work at speed, you can have others who are looking at the slow. So, I may be speaking like an ethnographer, and that's no surprise, but sometimes looking at the particulars and being able to reread those letters to see if you can smell vinegar, that is the only way of trying to get at some of that richness, to understand the different ways that these technologies are being used, but also the consequences of that complexity. The other thing that I like in Nyland's work is this idea of recognizing the different ways that privacy and trust and forms of accountability help shape social order, and seeing them as mechanisms for shaping this social order, and recognizing that you can see privacy as a way, again, here's a direct quote from his text, that privacy provides the focus for articulating a range of concerns about likely rights and wrongs, forms of access and problems with the bounded spaces of the technologies, and then all the different layers and levels of working with that technology. And also, I thought that idea, and this really resonated with me this morning when I heard the Premier's press conference, and she said, it's going to be now. It's a matter of trust as we go forward. So, in terms of how to continue to monitor the situation. So this is another form of surveillance. It may not be with CCTV cameras, but the surveillance that we're talking about now is connected to the way that we are shaping our sense of what our society is and what is important. And health and collective health and well-being and safety is important. And so that has to be acknowledged and recognized. But it is important to create a transparent way of engaging with this. And so I think that is also why I like the Nyland example, because I think what it flags is that you need to have this detailed engagement with the space and with the people in the space, and certainly the citizens from whom data is being taken warrant being included in that engagement. So to me, it's not an if, it's an essential. There needs to be that transparency with community engagement and review, because even if you're dealing with a digital environment, you are going to have to understand those social networks. And there are models for doing these community engagements in many of the medical practices. So that's just one. But I think the other reason, and this goes back to my observation about democracy and democratic values, we are in a democratic society. And as such, I think, this is just, this has to be a part of our DNA. But it's also important to recognize that different forms of democratic society will have different ways of addressing these issues. So media, having different channels for communication, having appropriate institutional arrangements, yes, those are the characteristics of a democracy, but it's not a one size fits all. And so I did have a second document that I thought we could play with just for a little while. And I think I have a feeling, I said too, I'll put this in the chat, unless Mark is faster than me, just to see. And again, this document will stay open. This isn't just for now, but it would be interesting to start populating this, again, to have a moment of reflection. So if we were to take lessons into our current discussion of privacy and the frameworks for building and maintaining trust, could we start to look at the different ways that issues of dealing with COVID and dealing with the different perceptions of vulnerability in these various political contexts, can we start to do some cross-matching? Can we basically build a grid where we're looking at the kinds of data policies that were already in place? That goes to that point about what kinds of trust frameworks existed pre-crisis. What kinds of communication channels are there and how are they characterized? What is the nature of public discourse? How open is that society to conversation and critique? And is there something that we can get out of that kind of critical comparison that we can take into the present crisis, but also take into the future so that we can set some kinds of regimes in place so that we are more resilient as a community, as a government, as a neighborhood? So while people are populating that, so that we can then go into closing comments, I just wanted to point out some other work that might help with thinking, getting to the point that you raised, Verity, around the difficulty that trust works both ways, and that it isn't easy when you're on the ground and you're having to make that decision. It's all well and good to talk about trying to give voice to the public and to people, but there are certain responsibilities then. So one possible way I just want to put to you, again, this is theoretical for people to think about, to comment in the chat boxes, and also to continue populating those documents. And if everyone has editorial rights on this. I've tried to make it as active a document as possible, both of them, so that I'd like to see how we might go forward in modeling new forms of public engagement. And I like this idea of interactive accounting that comes from Nyland, that I've expanded now to think about the different ways that we collectively have conversations about where to draw the line, and seeing that that line is moving constantly. And again, if you make that conversation visible, then the discussion about the category judgment starts to show you're genuine in your effort to draw a line and to establish an accountability relationship, so that even when you have to move that line, and I'm thinking here of the example that was put in about someone wrote in one of the documents that the line keeps changing, and that they keep passing different rules or setting up different obligations. And I think when knowledge is so rapidly evolving, that is not a surprise. But if there isn't sufficient trust that this is coming from an authentic space and a point of genuine interest in preserving well-being, then of course you're going to be very critical of that, and you're going to be very wary. But if we're having these ongoing interactive accounting conversations, then that also enables us to identify the vulnerable and to think about what is also overrepresented. But again, I come back to what I think is really missing in a lot of our conversations about these issues is that we need to build education into these campaigns and build a much more informed data public, not just speak on behalf of citizens, but start educating citizens to be able to be more confident and more competent and more confident in what they're doing. And that's really where these co-design tactics come into place. And I think that's how, so that's that shared document where I want you building in further observations now and tomorrow and over the weekend as to how we build education into those campaigns and determine the different ways of raising concerns over privacy and trust and making it in a way that can actually be used, not just shouting at one another, but actually building constructive conversations. And so that's the closing observations that I want to make on this, is that I think that, and again, you may have caught me on an optimistic day, but I think that a foundational framing that I would like to propose is that we make time to understand the landscape of knowledge production and not shy away from all its entangled human-machine complexity. I think appreciating that it is complex is a really important thing, acknowledging it, not just giving it lip service, but really acknowledging it and starting to design an evidence-based decision-making framework that takes that into account. So evidence is what we call it. So if we're only using evidence from one part of that complexity, then we don't have the full picture. So we need to start shaping those multi-perspective foundations so that that's our core, so that we have ethical expertise and practice as our necessary starting point. And I think we should stop shying away from the fact that as humans, we are not rational. That's what makes life worth living. Our value judgments are based on subjectivities and emotion. And that's not problematic if we build and maintain those trust-making frameworks, and if we have more transparency about the way that we are behaving as humans and giving the explanations as to why, and then having very open forums where we can debate and discuss the relative merits and the pros and cons and the price that is, as one says, what is the price of freedom? So I think that's what I call an ethical data practice. And it's not just about making the invisible visible, it's also about recognizing and valuing that customers and citizens are co-learners and co-designers in this process. And that, to me, is the inside out and the outside in way of building and refreshing government and building public trust. So I'm going to close on that and then turn us to that document. I wanted to come back to that beautiful map, the Body of Australia, which is based on the song lines that have been built over time by Indigenous communities around Australia. That's what it is representing. And the map of Australia looks like a body. And we know it's a body at the moment that is unwell, both ecologically in terms of the environment and now pathologically in terms of our biological warfare. I think the lesson that I take from the privileged conversations, or as I say, I've had the great privilege of having some wonderful conversations with members of Indigenous communities around Australia, and I've been learning to appreciate complexity one connection at a time. And that again takes time, and I know it may feel like we don't have time, but I think we have to build pauses much more actively into all that we're doing so that we individually and collectively reflect better. And I know, talking about time, I feel like we're running out of time, but I wanted to put that there as giving us some food for thought on the mechanisms at a social level that have to be set up if we're going to build public trust. Verity.
That was great. I don't want to interrupt your really fantastic ending, and I do actually love ending on such a positive note. I was just reminding myself of a article I read once where they talked about one of the big reasons why universal education, or at least universal primary education, was first introduced into Britain was because they were expanding the franchise. So as the those who were already in power started to realise that there was going to be a whole lot of other people getting to have a bit more of a say, they started to introduce universal free education, at least for males in primary school. And I think you can say, but I think you can get, I think that's a nice analogy for why education is also just so important as we face these complexities and as data starts to be such a huge driver in our lives in so many ways. Education is absolutely critical.
Yep. So I just wanted to flag while people are still there before they sign off that the document's open, and if anyone has difficulty getting in, they can contact me or Mark and I'll make sure they can get in, because I would love to see this still build and grow. And then if anyone's interested in pausing and having some collective analysis time, then please let me know, so that we can start modeling this. And I know this is far too complex for a remote conversation, but I thought it's interesting to just as we gather evidence about the different ways that tracker apps are discussed in these places, it's worth thinking about the way that the democratic fabric of each of those contexts relates to the existing trust, the existing policies, but also the possibilities.
And for those who would like a copy of tonight's presentation, I've put the link into the chat also, so you can find all the material there. It won't yet have the recordings, and we're just doing our best to get that up onto a streaming service because it is quite large.
And for those of you who are going to join the Privacy Summit on the 8th of May, we've asked each of our Masterclass presenters to capture or distill all of the main issues which are highlighted during today's session and previous sessions in a 7-minute video. So that's something which we will challenge our presenters to capture all of that. I have to say, subtle, wonderful, thought-provoking conversation into a very succinct presentation, but also would welcome a distillation in a written form as well.
Ian, a technical question before you go. Are we able to, I know in Zoom you can download the chat. Can we do that in Teams as well? Do you know?
We should be able to, but I'll point you towards Mark.
I will make that available, and I'll put that into the Google Drive as a future reference so no one loses it.
Thank you.
So, folks, we're soon to the end of this session. There are still 3 minutes left. I'll be dialing off to my next meeting on the hour. But we will then enter what is wonderfully known as the electronic version of the after the masterclass chat, where you can stay and chat and discuss. If we're still recording, I wouldn't say this, but if you've got a glass of wine and you want to have a glass of wine with Teresa and Verity, you probably could arrange that at your own discretion without any encouragement. Otherwise, I'm sure they'd be happy to sit around and talk to you for a little bit longer.
Yeah, I certainly would. And before everybody goes, I just want to say thank you very much for participating. I feel, and Verity and I talked about this, and it's, if we were doing this face to face, there would be Post-it notes all over the place. We would be lingering and chatting over wine and engaging. I'm delighted to see how people were contributing to the Google Doc. I know it's really hard to be active, but also share your thoughts. And that's why the one benefit we have in this forum is that those documents will stay live and open. So please keep talking there. And I'll linger if I can have a moment to just go away and grab a drink and have a comfort break. If anyone wants to stick around, I'm willing to stick and have a chat, because I would love to hear from other voices.
Teresa, that's great. Could I just ask you to stop sharing your screen, because what we're seeing is a reflection of what's on your screen at the moment, and it's
dear.
really, don't be sorry. It's just really an interesting artifact of these sort of virtual presentations. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right, thank you both very, very much, and I look forward to your summary, and thank you all for attending tonight.
And thank you very much for giving us the opportunity. Thank you.
Always my pleasure. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.